I have been asked in the past few days a number of times to explain or shed some light on the recent or latest round of violence that is engulfing the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis. There's a bit more to it than we hear in the news, and a lot of what we hear in the news is about accusations and counter-accusations. Hamas terrorists this, Israel killing civilians that, Israel's right to defend itself, and so on. What I'm going to try in the next video is to hopefully divide the problem into a number of segments, 3 segments. They're all interrelated, but they can be distinct from each other a little bit, in the hope that by the end of the video, those who do not follow this type of news day in, day out would be able to make a bit more sense of it. Right, so the first thing we would like to focus on is that there has been a continuous shift towards the right in the Israeli society. Now, this has been going on for decades, but in the last couple of which this has manifested itself more clearly, election after election, more clearly. There could be many reasons why any society at any given time veering towards the right or towards the left, depending on the challenges and so on. But we believe what is happening here is more of a permanent shift, a more consolidated shift towards the right. And the main reason behind that is or are the settlements in the Arab-occupied territories. Jewish settlements, that is. Settlers tend to vote right-wing. They don't have to be religiously motivated. They don't have to be an ultra-Orthodox person who believes in a God-given right of having all this land to themselves. They could simply be people who would be afraid of losing what they believe to be their property should a liberal government come and take the elections, win the elections, and reach a settlement with the Palestinians based, for example, on a 2-state solution. So they will vote right. Now the issue is that out of the Israeli electorate, apparently some 20% live in such settlements, which would translate in any given election into a 20% jumpstart for right-wing and religious parties. Now, this it bypasses the elections and who governs, because so this is not about Arabs being frustrated for not being in power or whatever, but what actually happens when you have a continuous shift or like a durable right-wing governance is that it trickles down into the state. With government appointees, judicial appointments, police appointments, whatever. And over the decades, this has eroded or eaten into the perception of impartiality that the Arab population inside what is known as Israel proper lives or believes. So they feel that they are coming second best, or everything or anything that is happening at their expense. Take, for example, what has happened recently after the Sheikh Jarrah problem started. There has been some tension, and for example, in the Lud city east of Jerusalem, a Jewish settler shot and killed a Palestinian or an Arab living in that city. Now, there were riots, the police intervened, they rounded up the culprit and his cohort, a total of 4 people. But apparently a settlement was reached between their defense team and the judiciary or the prosecution team, whereby they would be tried for a lesser offense. They were, I would say, acquitted but released without bail. Israeli police or border police trying to quash the rebellion or whatever, and only arresting Arabs. All these incidents feed into and reinforce this perception that the state itself is, amongst the Arab Israelis that is, or the Palestinians, that the state itself is becoming less and less impartial. Now we need to watch this space, because this problem is not going away and it may go complicated. Why it's not going away? Because currently, after 5 elections, indecisive elections that couldn't produce a proper government in Israel, make no mistake, there is a majority of right wing, but there are other considerations, probably personal considerations. They might bury the hatchet at this moment in time and say it's time for unity and form a proper right-wing government. We're hearing noises by Naftali Bennett towards that effect. So this would mean another right-wing government, probably for 4 years now, or we don't know what. And what would it do? It probably would encourage settlements, and then if so, then most definitely it would have or harvest more votes in the future. Now it may get complicated because so far what we know as the the Palestinian resistance, or Hamas in particular, they have taken an initiative towards the troubles in Sheikh Jarrah, that is occupied East Jerusalem. They might decide that okay, so we're going to go and support our brethren who live inside the 1948 Green Line. So it could pretty much go more complicated, and this is one consideration we need to keep an eye on. Okay, so the second point to focus on is the trigger for this entire episode of violence that we're currently seeing, which is the Sheikh Jarrah incident or problem. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem. Arabs who lived there for decades are being kicked out of their houses so that Jewish settlers could come and live there instead. Now, it is called evictions, and this gives the impression that there is a due process, a fair judiciary, a fair litigation that is taking place between peers, everyone or every party presenting their evidence, and the Arabs unfortunately coming second best. You could argue that this is not the case, but I would start with the question of whether an Israeli court in the first place has jurisdiction over East Jerusalem, an occupied territory. Now, everyone obviously are entitled to their own opinion on that matter, but I would start there. Now, we've come a long way since 1948, and by that I mean the residents of Sheikh Jarrah, the Palestinians there, aren't currently being lined against the wall and shot dead so that their neighbors and the neighboring villages would flee in terror and Jewish settlers could come and live there instead. Whether civilized or uncivilized, actually, and I'm referring to 1948 because this is the same problem. This is the story of Palestine. Basically, the problem, which is gaining more foothold with whatever tool available, violent, judiciary, civilized, uncivilized, you name it, in order to kick out as many Arabs as possible and bring more settlers to live in their presence. And this has been going on again for decades. You could see the pictures. A settler wanders into a woman's house or back garden, and he starts checking things, and she asks him, "What on earth are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, if I don't take this house, someone else will, so please calm down." You could imagine a discussion going on. I like that bicycle, but I don't like particularly cats, so you could keep the pet and so on. It is very absurd. Now, this issue has been where Hamas, or the Palestinian resistance, wanted to draw a line. And this is the core issue that we're seeing, and most probably there will be no settlement that is going to take place in the coming days or weeks without tackling this issue one way or the other, because both parties are digging their heels, the Israelis and the Palestinian resistance. One thing to consider here as well, finally, is that Hamas, or the Palestinian resistance, wouldn't or shouldn't have seen this problem of Sheikh Jarrah coming out of the blue. They would have seen it coming, and this, one would argue, means or would mean that they have planned for the initiative that they have taken, which is to engage militarily with Israel in order to draw a line on the settlement issue and Arab evictions. So The final thing that, or the final thought that we're going to focus on today, and where it actually gets a bit complicated, is when we examine the wider scene surrounding the clashes and the violence taking place between the Israelis and the Palestinians, i.e. regional stakeholders and international stakeholders. In principle, Hamas and the Palestinian resistance factions would argue that whenever something bad happens to the Arabs in the occupied territories, then it's going to be their business. That's exactly the claim that they are staking here when they fired the first salvo of the rockets. However, we need to consider something else, a much bigger initiative that has been brewing for the past 2 or 3 years, namely the deal of the century and the resulting Abraham Accords, whereby some Arab states, a few of them, normalized their relationships with Israel. This has been proposed by the previous US administration under President Donald Trump, and in a way it could be pretty much summed up by the idea that, you know, this is a final offer to the Palestinians: take it or leave it. You're going to take what is left on the table, otherwise you're going to lose badly. And look, we're getting the other Arabs to our side as well, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about it. The Palestinians at the time refused the initiative. It doesn't say anything about the two-state solution, and it's really counter everything that has been happening on the peace front for the past 25 years since the Oslo Accords, and even more than that. And basically what they sought to do is to have a mandate. They sought a fresh mandate from the Palestinian people through, or in the form of fresh elections, long due elections actually, presidential, legislative and so on. And their expectation is that they would get a resounding no from, or a resounding no sort of mandate from the Palestinian people in order to counter this proposal. Look, the Palestinian people do not want this, and they've clearly cast their votes in the ballot. Now, the last thing, and this is, you know, how to link these things. The last thing the United States, the Israel, or all the sponsors of this deal of the century would want right now is for the upcoming Palestinian elections, which hit a snag, by the way, very recently, when Israel prevented the Arabs of East Jerusalem from casting their votes or participating, which mainly prompted President Mahmoud Abbas to postpone the elections, even though there were internal divisions to blame as well. But the last thing those sponsors of the Abraham Accords and the deal of the century would want now is for Hamas to come out on top in the current conflict, or to go unscathed, having proven that their initiative was in the right direction, and that they staked a claim that whatever happens in the territories, occupied territories, to the Arabs is their business. They do not want a repetition of the 2006 election whereby Hamas had won a landslide in Gaza. I still remember the face of President George W. Bush announcing or reacting to the announcement of the results, and he was clearly unhappy, and definitely things didn't go according to plan at that time. So those sponsors of this deal of the century are now hesitant. If they go heavy-handed on Gaza, there would be more bloodshed. There is also to consider a state of unity between Palestinians inside and outside Israel and in the occupied territories and so on. And the last thing they would want is for this, unity to foster. So they're trying to separate things, and they're not really, trying to end this anywhere soon. In fact, they're giving themselves, as we can see, with the United States' reluctance to allow the Security Council to have some say in what is happening, have a statement at least, let alone a decision. Try to postpone things so as to give time to mediators like Egypt or Qatar to try and talk some sense into the Hamas mind. But it is clear from the very beginning that Hamas knew what they were doing, and that nothing is going to happen. This conflict, current conflict, or state of affairs, the violence is not going to stop unless the issue of Sheikh Jarrah is visited. It cannot be, put under the carpet, swept under the carpet. This, of course, practically speaking, has a lot to do with the sustainability of the Hamas initiative, how long they can fire rockets. Do they have other surprises to counter whatever Israeli escalation that might take place and inflict more damage onto the Israeli infrastructure and whatever, and that's where it gets also linked to the Israeli elections, should they take place anywhere soon. So all of that comes into play, and also other stakeholders in the region like Hezbollah, who might be drawn into some conflict because of an error here or there or whatever, which would then complicate matters a lot more. So all of this is under consideration at this moment in time, and people trying to drive the conflict forward slowly. There are obviously casualties, but it's nothing like this is a full-scale war yet. But we have to keep an eye and see how this ends. But anyway, Hamas definitely seems, or the as called the Palestinian resistance option, very much seems to be currently in the driving seat because of all things considered of what has happened in the past couple of weeks.